Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Louisiana Leaders webinar on understanding the racial wealth gap. My name is Mary Johns, and I'm the Strategic Communications and Engagement Manager at United Way of Southeast Louisiana. We'd love to see who's joining us today, so if you don't mind, go ahead and drop your name and organization in the chat box. We have a packed program with some fantastic speakers that we're excited to bring to you. So I'm going to jump right into a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you via email afterwards. So if you have any issues with connectivity or audio, don't worry, you'll be able to go back and watch the webinar afterwards. Also, all participants are muted. So please, if you'd like to engage during the webinar, which we definitely encourage, use the chat box. And one note on the chat box, if you'd like your message to be public, please make sure to select the all panelists and attendees option. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to United Way President and CEO, Michael Williamson.
Well, thanks, Mary. Let me start off by thanking all of our attendees, our presenters, whom you're going to love to hear from today, and of course, our United Way staff, Mary Johns, and so many others that help us pull together this informative series. Just so you know, and if you've been a part of prior Louisiana Leaders series, this ties to our commitment to inform the community of issues that contribute to poverty throughout Southeast Louisiana, and more importantly, our plan to address it, which is our blueprint for prosperity, where we seek to help families achieve stability today and get on a pathway to prosperity tomorrow so they can live their lives personally well and in vibrant communities. Our plan is to eradicate poverty throughout Southeast Louisiana, and in particular, we focus on ALICE households, those households that are asset limited, income constrained, yet still employed, oftentimes working more than one job. And they represent about 1 out of every 2 households throughout Southeast Louisiana. And they can't afford the basics, or even have the ability to save for the future. And we know specifically that households of color are disproportionately ALICE, therefore have been disproportionately affected by things like COVID-19. In particular, this conversation today around the racial wealth gap ties to our efforts to build stability today and prosperity tomorrow. And we know that those are key to closing the gap and creating a more equitable Southeast Louisiana. So really excited to have you with us today. Once again, you're going to love to hear from our speakers or some of the best thought leaders in this space. And so with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, my colleague, and United Way Southeast Louisiana's Chief Impact Officer, Mary Ambrose. Mary.
Thank you, Michael. And I'm so excited for this conversation today. Welcome. And thank you all for joining us in our discussion about the racial wealth gap. I am Mary Ambrose. I'm the Chief Impact Officer for the United Way of Southeast Louisiana. So we're just going to jump into this conversation. So just a little bit about, according to Prosperity Now, only half of Americans realize that there's a wide gap in financial well-being between white households and households of color. However, even among those who do recognize racial economic inequality, there's a widespread misconception that the problem is only based on a difference in income. The problem is much deeper than that. When we consider wealth, which is the financial capital families need to expand their economic opportunity and agency, the disparity facing households of color grows even larger. As United Way continues our focus on eradicating poverty, we can't ignore the racial wealth gap. So we wanted to provide an opportunity to delve deeper into racial inequities, disparities, and gaps related to the racial wealth gap. We know through our work to develop our blueprint for prosperity that you have to engage your community. So today we have engaged community leaders and residents to share their unique perspective and experiences. Also, to level set this conversation, I'm going to I can't say very enough, quickly review a few data points on the racial wealth gap, especially in regards to income, housing, and businesses. Next slide, please. So the racial wealth gap, according to Prosperity Now, to create an economy that works for all of us, we need to understand and address the racial wealth inequality. And as I said before, people think about the income gap as being the problem. The income gap is basically the wages someone earns from a job or from capital gains. And that stands at 42% difference between Black and whites, with Blacks earning 35,000 medium income and whites at 61,000. The problem comes with the wealth gap, which is wealth or net worth is the value of assets owned by a family, such as a home or a savings account, minus those outstanding debts like a mortgage or student loans. And accumulated over time, wealth is a resource of retirement income, and it protects against short-term economic shocks, and it provides security and social status for future generations. And you see here that nationally, we have a 90% wealth gap, with Blacks at 17,000 and whites at 171,000. So the Brookings 2020 report examining the white wealth gap shows that the ratio of white family wealth to Black family wealth is higher today than at the start of the century. And the wealth gap remains with when looking within the age, and it also remains even for families with the same income. Next slide, please. So very quickly, I'm going to go through these slides. I'm sorry, the slides are jumping. Through the slides with you, pointing out the income inequality. And we really stayed on New Orleans, the metro area. We tried to really give you data in our area. So if we looked at income poverty by race in New Orleans, you'll see that white households are doing better than the national average, where Black households of color are doing much worse. Also, when we look at median household income by race, we see that that income has been declining for Hispanics and Blacks since 2010, whereas whites have been able to maintain their incomes. And we look at liquid asset poverty and asset poverty. And again, whites are below the national average, and Blacks and households of color are way above the national average in liquid asset poverty and asset poverty. Next slide. When we looked at income inequality, especially for women and Black women in the US, we know Black women in the US are paid 38% less than white men and 21% less than white women. But you think about that over a lifetime, and you see that Black women lose almost $1 million over a lifetime, and white women lose almost $500,000 over a lifetime, and all women lose $407,000 over a lifetime. Next slide. Then we looked at housing inequities, and we looked at homeownership rates in New Orleans Metro. And as you see, whites and Asians are above the national average of 65.5%, and households of color are way below the national average in home ownership rates. And then we looked at the value of those properties. And I want you to pay attention to New Orleans, and you look at the median value of those homes is $173,000. But for white households, the value is $300,000, and Black and Asian households at $150,000. And I thought that was interesting, that while Asians had a home ownership rate close to whites, the value of their properties were the same as Black households. Next slide. And then we looked at business ownership in New Orleans, and businesses without paid employees, 97% of Black owned businesses did not have paid employees, whereas 75% and 77% Asian and whites did not have paid employees. And the value of those businesses, Black businesses, were valued at $35,000 $237,000, whereas white businesses were valued at $487,000. Now, let me say, we have not given you all of the data. I would be here all day, right, Lamar, with data. So we just wanted to give you some highlights. You probably have seen this countless numbers of times, but just to kind of level set the conversation as we move into our discussion, that you have some basis for this. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I just want to introduce our speakers. I'm just so thankful to all of you for joining us for this discussion. First, we're going to listen to a video from Miss Helena Ellie. She is an IDA participant who has come through our Prosperity Center to purchase a home through our individual development account program, where we match their savings. And I want you to listen to Miss Ellie's testimony, because I want you to think about when you bought your home, or if you haven't purchased a home, what were those barriers? What were the things that you had in place that enabled you to buy a home? And if you didn't have any problems, but if you did have problems, what were those barriers? So just think about that as you listen to her story. Once we hear from Miss Ellie, we'll have Lamar Gardere, who is the executive director of the Data Center. And the Data Center is the most trusted resource for data about Greater New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana. And it was founded in 1997, incubated at United Way. But they publish fully independent research and analysis, providing a comprehensive look at issues that matter most to our region. Then we'll hear from Charmaine Caccioppi, who is the executive vice president and COO of United Way Southeast Louisiana, and she serves as the lead on all United Way UWSELA policy and advocacy work. And she's also my boss, so she's bad. So, and then we have Stacy Roussel, who is the policy director at the Louisiana Budget Project. The Louisiana Budget Project monitors and reports on public policy and how it affects Louisiana's low to moderate income families. They believe that the lives of Louisianians can be improved through profound change in public policy. And then last, but definitely not least, is Alan Square, the CEO of Square Button, representing the Campaign for Equity New Orleans. And the campaign is led by a small advisory group of organizers. The campaign works to educate, connect, and mobilize leadership throughout the city in order to address areas of systemic racism and build a more equitable future for New Orleans. They have a vision of making New Orleans the most equitable city in America. So those will be our speakers, and we can go to the next slide, and we will hear Ms. Helena Ellie's testimony.
Ellie. I am a former IDA participant with United Way, New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm here to talk a little bit about my experience going through the program. I came through the program IDA out of a desire to purchase a home. I've always wanted to own my own home. IDA has, United Way IDA program has provided an opportunity for me to buy my home. It gave me the down payment that I needed to be able to put down on my home. I came out of a need for housing because I was actually displaced from Hurricane Katrina, homeless, working, but didn't have anywhere steady and stable to live. Moved around a tremendous amount because of the lack of housing that the city of New Orleans was experiencing, and actually is still experiencing. Those gap disparities between minorities or a big number. The IDA program helps with providing assistance with that down payment. I went from being very unstable, working a whole lot, not really getting anywhere, chasing my own tail, to becoming a homeowner. And I closed on my house November 19th, 2019, right before the COVID happened. And I couldn't be happier. I love my new home. To talk a little bit more about the IDA program, I was paired up with one of the best counselors, the best counselor in the world. Her name is Donna Darrensburg. Miss Darrensburg was a very, very important person in my life. She was very, very helpful to me, very encouraging. I was already motivated, but she made sure she kept me on top when I had those few moments of insecurity of wondering if it was going to happen. She kept me on the ball with everything. I was very diligent with Ms. Darrensburg and making sure that I met all of the requirements, got everything to her when she asked me for documents, didn't procrastinate. I was on the ball getting things done. And I was so excited. Went through Fidelity Bank, who was the servicer of that funding. They were very nice at Fidelity Bank. I was just so excited. I finally felt like I was accomplishing something in my life. My parents were not able to leave me with housing or anything, or passing down wealth, real estate. So I wanted to be able to do that for my kids. And I just feel great about it. I really do. I love the IDA program. I love United Way. They're one of the programs that do what they're supposed to do. The people in the community get the money. And I know because I'm one of the people that receive the money from the United Way program. And I will be looking to see if there are any other programs that I could get into, because they're creating a sense of wealth. It's no greater feeling to be able to turn the key to a door and say, it's mine, I own it. And as long as I pay that mortgage and those taxes, no one can ever take it from me. United Way also has helped me with a payment, one or two payments, I can't remember, but they've helped me pay my mortgage since the COVID, because my job was affected by it. I had reduced hours. And we're still going through some things with COVID. So that was a great help to me. I really, really appreciated that. I'm not sure where that donation came from. I think BET may have done it. Shout out to BET, Black Entertainment Television. When Essence Fest comes, that's one of my favorite festivals, because I'm always motivated to do better in life after leaving an Essence Fest concert. But United Way does what they're supposed to do with the money, and the community gets the money, because I'm a part of the community. And we do need that funding for minorities. There is racial disparities. And there are a lot of people, a lot of women that want to buy homes. They just don't know how to go about doing it. You do have to do your work. You do have to desire it and want it. You do have to do hard work. You do have to have your credit together. You do have to save. You do have to be diligent and disciplined with your finances. So it's some work that the participant has to do too. It's not a, just give me program. You have to work for it. You have to want it. You have to desire it, and you have to do the hard work. No pain, no gain. But they're there for you to back you up. And once you do what you have to do, they will cut you the check. I know I have copies of the check that was cut to me, and it just feels really good. Really, really good. Another program that I participate in with United Way is the VITA program with the taxes every year. That's a big, big help, not having to pay somebody to do my taxes, because $50 is $50, but that's $50 that I don't have to pay to get taxes done when I could put that in my savings account. So that's another program that I benefited from United Way. And I just have nothing but good things to say about United Way. Great, 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 awesome program. Also, Chiquita, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She's been a great help to me too. Always let me know if there's resources they can help with, even providing masks. Something as simple as providing the masks during the COVID-19. That's been a great help, because those masks are expensive. And because my hours were cut, I really have been trying to be real disciplined with my money and my finances. If I don't need to spend something, buy something, I won't buy it. I have a daughter who has asthma, and I was really, really concerned about her when the COVID first came out. So Chiquita, United Way provided the face coverings, masks during COVID, and that's a big help. That's the disposable ones, and actually they're better because you can breathe through those. But that's a big help. So also I signed up for the newsletter that United Way has, so I can stay informed on different programs that they have. United Way is just one of those programs that I just really cannot say enough about. And if I'm ever in a position where I can write big checks, you never know. United Way will definitely be number one on my list. Thank you so much. The program has been awesome. I hope that people keep donating to the program. I hope that the resources keep getting to the community, especially the Black communities, because we need it. We want to live here in New Orleans, Louisiana. People want to stay in their communities. They're familiar with them. We like knowing our neighbors. We like going to the nearby bakery or maybe open up a bakery. We're still rebuilding here in New Orleans. So the more resources we get and the help we can get is a big help, because the same person who works in housekeeping may one day want to open up a bakery or something, or start their own business, or buy a home, or maybe they just need a car or something. People need help. Sometimes they just don't know how to go about getting the help. They want to do better. Sometimes people just don't know how to do better. So maybe if we can teach them and show them how to do better, they can. I did.
So we're getting. So thank you so much for listening to Miss Ellie's story. It's a very important story that we think could level set this conversation. So I'm going to quickly move into Lamar. I'm coming to you. So Miss Ellie talked about generational poverty and the inability. And when I talked to her, she talked about the inability of her parents to leave her anything for her to pass on to her children. And she clearly saw the purchase of her home as investing in her own wealth building, and that real estate over time created that wealth. Help us understand from a historical perspective why African Americans haven't been able to build wealth at the rate of whites, and the structural barriers they face to own a home, start a business, acquire a livable income.
Happy to do that, Mary. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants joining today, and to United Way and their leadership for inviting us to this conversation. We appreciate being able to come before you with this. Are the slides available? There we go. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. As Mary and the previous speaker said, much of what we see in terms of inequity these days is tied to the racial wealth gap. And that wealth gap didn't just manifest on its own. It isn't just because of people who didn't manage to get high salaries and things like that. There are some built-in reasons why this wealth gap exists. There are three areas that we're going to examine quickly to help better understand it: salaries and wages, business ownership, and home ownership. Of course, salaries and wages is the most accessible way to facilitate wealth generation, because anybody that works earns a salary or wage. So it's a direct way to build wealth. Business ownership is about the fastest way to build wealth, but home ownership is where wealth currently lies, and where you can see the majority of the wealth gap. Next slide, please. To understand it, though, we want to go back to New Orleans' very early history. Early on, because French and Spanish rule was unusual in the rights of the 40 to the enslaved, New Orleans was one of the most diverse places in the country. in fact, with the largest population of free people of color in the South. In fact, by about 1810, New Orleans was about a third enslaved, a third free people of color, and a third white. And at this time, economic prosperity was largely related to population. And New Orleans was the third largest city in the country. So that immigration and more permissive set of rules that New Orleans and Louisiana had early on allowed for better growth, creating more economic prosperity locally. Next slide, please. What's important in this history lesson is where people were allowed to settle once they were here in this diverse city at the time. Settlement was largely based on risk and nuisance. And what that means is white people in general settled in the higher areas of the city. Those areas that had low nuisance, like lower levels of mosquitoes and other pests and things like that. Remember, New Orleans was a swamp that was being drained at this time. And the white people were able to settle in those areas of the city that were, again, higher and had fewer nuisances, leaving the lower lying, more flood prone lands in those that had a higher nuisance to immigrant populations and Black people. You can see those patterns here. On the left, you can see where the low nuisance, low risk areas are in green, and the high nuisance, high risk areas in red. If you look to the map on the right, you can see where different groups settled. And lo and behold, immigrant populations settling and Black populations settling along the river where there was high nuisance and high flood, and in the back of town areas that were just being drained, and white people settling in that commercial corridor from the French Quarter on through uptown. Next slide, please. Still, the map, despite these regulations on who could settle where, the map from 1910 shows that we were fairly racially integrated in terms of our neighborhoods. And that's primarily because people were allowed to live near where they worked, right? And since we had Black people working in a lot of white establishments and white houses, we were very well mixed in that regard. Next slide, please. But by the mid 20th century, racist policies, laws, and practices such as redlining had taken hold in the city and across the nation. In fact, post-World War II, the federal government began to encourage homeownership as a way to allow people to participate in capitalism to a greater extent, but it was based on racist notions of residential segregation and risk, creating huge disparities in who owned land, where they could own it, and the property values associated with it. Unsurprisingly, Black people were intentionally locked out of neighborhoods that were growing fast, like new suburban areas, or those that were historically safer and nicer, which tended to be white neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And we live with this legacy of redlining and racist real estate practices today. You can see in 1960, we were largely segregated, with African-American being the yellow dots here and white being the blue dots. You can see how segregated we were in 1960 at the start of white flight, when we had white people largely heading out to the suburbs. And you can see that by 2010, we still are in similar situations in terms of our residential segregation, far more segregated than we were at the turn of the 20th century. We know that residential segregation creates a range of problems, but one of the most profound ones is its impact on wealth. And because we've chosen to couple wealth with homeownership, it is the case that white people were allowed to build equity in their properties early on, while that same opportunity was not afforded to Black people in the region. That structural racism built into the real estate and homeownership programs now serves as the overlay for who has and can generate wealth now. It's still the case that from 1970 to about now, the rates of home ownership have closed significantly, but there's still a 13 percentage point gap between Black and white. And while we can see that closing of disparities as progress, due to the nature of redlining, the value of the homes owned by people of color remains significantly less than the value of homes owned by white people, as you saw in the data that Mary showed earlier. Of course, having less equity in your house means a lot of different things. It means you have less wealth that can be passed down to future generations. You have decreased access to loans to start a business, to pay for education, or to weather financial shocks and stresses, or health crises such as the one that we're living through right now. And so the inequity that we created decades ago has served to be the thing that has led the disparities that we see today. Next slide, please. So the effects of this legacy remains. It can be seen in some ways in household income. This is household income for New Orleans. You can see that white household income in recent times is about $68,000. And for Black households, it's about $25,000. When you look at the metro area, you can see that it's a little bit different. $64,000 for white, $29,000 or so for Black. Interestingly, you can see this pattern of increasing household incomes for white and either steady or decreasing household income for Black. That's not just because of access to jobs and promotions and salary increases and things like that. It's tied again to residential segregation and settlement patterns. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is the suburbanization of poverty, as it's called. And it's the process of folks moving who are less affluent, having to move out to the suburbs as they're not able to afford the housing in the inner cities, and more affluent people moving in. So in this way, the same patterns of pushing what is essentially Black folks who are lower earning into housing that cannot appreciate at the same rate, cannot gain equity at the same rate, while allowing more affluent white populations into those areas where the property will continue to increase in equity quickly over time. That process is still in play, just for different reasons. And so we see it being perpetuated. Next slide, please. So in terms of employment, we can see clearly where some of the issues exist. We can see that in 1980, between 1980 and 1990, we saw decreasing employment rates for all men and increasing employment rates for all women. But from 1990 to 2016, we saw a recovery of those employment rates for all men except Black men in New Orleans, whose employment rate continued to fall from 63% in 1980 down to 52% in 2016. We can see that as one of the primary places why we continue to have issues around equity and wealth generation here in New Orleans. And if you can see from the chart above to the chart at the bottom, that drop in employment roughly coincides with the loss of oil and gas and port jobs during this time, leading into the rise of tourism jobs. Unfortunately, those tourism jobs have not managed to maintain the same levels of salary that the oil and gas and port jobs were able to provide, which were jobs that were largely available to a diverse set of New Orleanians. Next slide, please. Many folks have seen that this same issue continues to exist around businesses. Even though 40% of businesses in New Orleans are Black owned, they only account for about 2% of receipts. When we dig into that problem, we can see that that's largely because many of the Black owned businesses do not have employees. Only 3.9% of businesses had paid employees that were Black. 3.9% of the businesses were Black owned and had paid employees. Next slide, please. This disparity continues to bear itself out when you look further at the stats around business health. And you can see that when you look at businesses that earn $250,000 or more, you see a gap between Black and white. 52% of businesses, Black-owned businesses, earn over $250,000, and 68, almost 69% of white-owned businesses earn over $250,000. There's a gap, but it's not as big. But when you increase that threshold to 500,000, you can see that that gap grows much more significantly. Only 28% of Black-owned businesses earn over $500,000 a year, and 50% of white-owned businesses earn over that threshold. So we can see the gaps are starting to grow as we look at businesses that are more healthy and earn more revenue. You know, that's percentages. If you look at the map on the chart on the left, you can see that there's a significant difference in terms of scale. The green bar being white businesses, the blue bars being Black-owned businesses, just huge numbers more of white-owned businesses who are earning more than their Black counterparts. Next slide, please. Similarly, when you look at the numbers of Black-owned firms that have been in business for 5 years or more, you can see that 65% of Black-owned firms have been open for 5 years or more, and about 70% of white-owned firms have been open for 5 years or more. But again, as we start to look at years beyond 5 years, you can start to see growing gaps in terms of those businesses being able to stay open and earn revenue over the long haul. Again, very large numbers in scale. In terms of businesses that have been here 16 years or more, 7,800 white-owned businesses across the metro have been here, have been in existence that long, whereas only 253 of those businesses that have been here 16 years or more are Black-owned. So, you know, we can see these huge disparities in business ownership, in income, in wages, and many of those things tie back to where we live, who owns property, where we own that property, and how that property has been allowed to appreciate over time in a way that can be reinvested to grow assets later. And this is a closer look at the wealth gap and how it has developed and been supported by racist policies early on in our city and our nation's history. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Lamar, for that great information. If you have questions, please put it in the chat box. I'm sure Lamar will be happy to answer your questions. So I don't think we're going to have time to take questions, so that would be the best way to get your questions answered. So now we're going to move on to Charmaine Caccioppi. Charmaine, women of color often face tremendous barriers. As a double minority, they face both gender and racial discrimination. For many, education is a way out of poverty. And for women of color, particularly Black women, have become the most educated group of Americans. However, they earn less than their white counterparts and have less wealth than their white counterparts with lesser degrees or no degrees. So Charmaine, the Louisiana Women's Policy and Research Commission released their report on the status of women in Louisiana. Please share those findings, especially in relationship to race and gender, and why these disparities continue to exist.
Well, first, let me thank you, Mary, and I agree. For everyone joining us today, it is so important that we better understand the impact, and I can't thank you enough for giving me this opportunity to speak about the challenges women face. You know, Louisiana consistently ranks near the bottom of reports on the status of women. Gaps exist in almost every area between women and men, between women of color and white women, Southern women, and women living in other parts of the country. Clearly, our women deserve better. In addition to my role here at the United Way, I am honored to serve as the chair of the Louisiana Women's Policy and Research Commission. And I think it's important you understand that we are tasked at this commission with monitoring the status of women in Louisiana and identifying as well as analyzing trends that negatively impact their health, the health and prosperity of all women living in Louisiana. Today, I will share some highlights of the Commission's report, 2020 Status of Women Louisiana report. While we have a long way to go, I do want to at least acknowledge that there have been some positive things that are inching us forward in creating a better environment for women in Louisiana, but we have the potential to make significant progress through policy changes. Wage and wealth gap for women will be the topic I actually address now. Even before COVID-19, women in Louisiana faced many challenges in the workplace, including the largest gender wage gap in the United States. Women earn an average of 69 cents for every dollar earned by men. Black and Latino women are even worse off. They make only an average of 47 cents and 53 cents respectively compared to white men. The gap exists in all fields regardless of profession or educational background, and jobs predominantly filled by women are paid less than jobs mostly filled by men. Discrimination perpetuated by fear, secrecy, and prior low salaries fuel this incredible inequity. Next slide. COVID-19 has made matters a lot worse for women in the workplace. Nationally, women lost more jobs than men in 2020. Between February and December 2020, women lost 5.4 million jobs as compared to men losing 4.4 million. In December, I think it's important we understand that all of the 140,000 jobs lost were held by women. Women of color have been significantly affected. Black and Latino women disproportionately work in some of the hardest hit sectors that did not have the ability to continue to remain employed because they can't work from home. As daycares and schools closed, many women had to choose between working or parenting, and even better yet, caring for an elder. Next slide. The high cost of childcare and the lack of paid leave can limit work opportunities and earning potential for women with children. Only 35% of the new mothers in Louisiana were able to take any length of paid leave following childbirth, as compared to the national average of 55%. Childcare for women can cost up to 50% of a minimum wage worker's income. 2/3 of minimum wage workers in Louisiana are women. Next slide. It's important to understand the gender pay gap as part of a larger issue, the gender wealth gap. The gender wealth gap is fueled not only by pay, but also public policy structures and institutional practices that consistently ignore, dismiss, and devalue women. Issues like limited access to health insurance and retirement benefits, lack of access to caregiving supports such as paid leave and childcare, denial of access to credit and loans, discrimination in housing and education, the prevalence and underreporting of sexual harassment in the workplace. Between 25% and 50% of women report experiencing some form of sexual harassment in the workplace. Only 10% of those women will ever make a formal report. Next slide. The structural barriers to wealth are especially daunting for women of color who face generational or financial exclusion and economic fragility. We know that for every dollar a white man owns, women overall own 32 cents. Black and Latino women own just 1 penny. According to economists, inheritances and other intergenerational transfers account for more of the racial gap than any other demographic and socioeconomic indicator. We have the power to close the wealth gap through smart public policy. From slavery to Jim Crow, redlining to school segregation, from mass incarceration to environmental racism, policies have consistently impeded or inhibited Black people, and especially Black women, from having access to opportunities. To create an equitable economy where all women are thriving, we must promote policies designed to benefit women of color who are the most marginalized by structural and systematic racism. The policies that can help promote wealth equality for women of color in Louisiana include elimination of pay secrecy, enacting a higher living wage, providing paid sick and family leave, increasing access to quality, affordable early care and education, expanding Medicaid access to improve reproductive health, maternal mortality, birth outcomes, substance use and abuse services, ensuring equitable access to public incentives to help people save and invest and increase access to safe, affordable financial products and services, which will help build capital and grow financial prosperity. Creating pathways to STEM careers is also another opportunity to make sure that women are more representative in those fields. I hope the presentation I've provided you today gives you an overall analysis of the work that's being done by the Commission, and that everyone listening today will join us as we prepare for this new legislative session, because we will have an unprecedented opportunity to actually advance policies that I have just described to you. So thank you very much, Mary, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Charmaine. We really appreciate this information. And again, if you have questions for Charmaine or Lamar right now, put them in the chat box. They'll definitely answer your questions. So let's move on to Stacy Roussel with the Louisiana Budget Project. Stacy, in my conversation with Miss Ellie, she spoke about politicians creating laws and policies that had language that denied access to resources that could help people, but instead put up barriers and made things harder for people. We also just heard Charmaine talk about the policies that would help all women to move out of poverty. But what are those policies that have failed people of color and have caused financial harm?
Well, thank you, Mary. Let me begin just by thanking United Way for creating a space, especially as we are, I think, exiting slowly and hopefully through an incredibly difficult time dealing with COVID-19 and the impact that it has had on our New Orleans community and surrounding communities, but also what it's done on the national level to help raise awareness about racial disparities in our country. And so it's incredible to have a resource like United Way in our community to provide an avenue for us to really talk about and share information that can lead to change. So today I'm going to talk about taxes. I'm going to hopefully provide some information that's new and informative and helps to unravel a little bit of the impact of this structure that oftentimes we don't think about. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with a basic understanding, which is that in Louisiana, our tax system is regressive. And that means that we ask the most from households with the least. So in the top 20% of earning households, those are households who take in about $91,000 or more per year. They have a combined state and local tax rate of 7.3%. And as you earn more and more, the share of your income that is paid in taxes goes down further and further. The top 1% of earning households in our state pay a combined state and local tax rate of 6.1%. Now, if you compare that to households that are earning in the bottom 20%, and that's about $17,000 a year, they're paying a combined rate of 11.1. We can certainly do better than this. Now, to understand the racial impact that this has on our communities, next slide, please. We want to understand the racial composition of each of those income groups. And for many of the reasons that have been discussed by my fellow panelists and really throughout this series, we see an overconcentration of white folks in the high income brackets and an overconcentration of Black folks and brown folks in the bottom income levels. So let's think about what that means for tax rates overall by race. Next slide, please. So if we are able to look at the tax that is paid by white households versus Black households, you can see that white households pay the lowest combined state and local tax rate of 8.2%, while Black households pay the highest at 8.8%. The primary driver of this difference is sales tax. So let's talk a little bit about sales tax. The first sales tax was created in 1932 in Mississippi, and the governor promoted the tax change to property owners, saying not that this would create new revenue for state investments, but that it would help replace property tax revenue. What followed was a decrease in taxes owed by white property owners, and then an increase in taxes owed by Black non-property owning consumers. Once the viability of a sales tax was established in Mississippi, it was adopted throughout the country. And Louisiana adopted its first sales tax in 1938. Today, our state has the second highest combined state and local tax rate. And we have on the books a half penny clean sales tax that was part of a grand bargain in 2018 to keep the state from falling off of a fiscal cliff. But that sales tax will expire in 2025. It is good for the state to try to fix some of these inequities so that we can build wealth in our communities of color. And we know that that tax expiration is coming. So we're going to come back to some policy decisions we can make in order to adjust for some of these inequities. Next slide, please. Now, if we overlay the tax rate onto household income, and these are state household income levels, they're actually based on tax units, which are similar to household units, but you can see a slight derivation from what we've seen from the data center. But if you take the tax rates and you apply it to white households, and you take that and you apply it to Black households, overall in 1 year, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars of difference in what is paid in taxes because of those disparities. So when we think about tax rates, 8.2% and 8.8% can seem like a small difference. But when you talk on an aggregated level, then we start to appreciate the difference that a 0.6% difference can make just in 1 year. Next slide, please. So I would be remiss if I didn't draw attention to one of the other structural pieces in our economy, which is the industry mix. This is for the state as a whole, not just the New Orleans area. But you can see that as the state has evolved over time, the 4 largest industries by number of jobs created in our state each pay a wage that is below the ALICE threshold for a family of 4. And I would imagine most folks who are on this presentation know about the ALICE measure. It's a tremendous resource that United Way publishes on for the state of Louisiana. But this is the wage that it takes to support a family. And so it's important to keep in mind that it's not only a tax structure, but an industry mix that's impacting wealth creation in communities of color. Next slide, please. So we've talked about how sales tax, which is highly regressive, is impacting our overall inequities in our tax structure. One of the other primary drivers is the income tax. Income tax in Louisiana is progressive, but it's made less so by the use of a large deduction called the Fed deduction. The way this works is that our households in Louisiana can deduct the taxes that they pay to the federal government from what is taxable for the Louisiana government. This benefit accrues far, far disproportionately to high income households. About 80% of this benefit goes to the top 20% of households. And those households we know are disproportionately white households. What this means is that each year, the state is foregoing revenue through the largest single income tax deduction to the tune of about $800 to $900 million a year. And we'll talk about why we cannot afford to have that kind of tax break. Louisiana is one of only 2 states left that allows for an unlimited Fed deduction of income taxes. We are absolutely an outlier in this policy. Next slide, please. So what does all of that mean for household income and wealth building? When you take the combined effects of all of the different policies that have come to create what we currently have as our tax structure, you'll see that for those households who start further ahead in income, white households and Asian households, after you overlay our tax structure, they get further ahead. And those who start behind everyone else get further behind. So our tax structure is making matters worse. Now, one of the other key pieces that's happened historically that's impacting our system today is the supermajority requirement to raise revenue. The Fed deduction is one of those policies that would require a supermajority vote to repeal and change. So where did the supermajority first come from? It also came from Mississippi, a constitutional convention in 1890. This convention was convened explicitly to disenfranchise the Black voters. The delegate who first proposed the supermajority requirement to raise revenue is quoted as saying, "All understood and desired that some scheme would be evolved, which would effectively remove from the sphere of politics in the state the ignorant and unpatriotic Negro." The supermajority requirement was adopted. Louisiana followed adopting it as well, and remains in place not only in Louisiana, but in 17 other states in the nation. The supermajority requirement to raise revenue harms states' abilities to react to recessions, and it also entrenches many of the special interests who over time have been able to carve out deductions and exemptions. Next slide, please. So today's tax structure is not only a product of decisions that were made in the far past, but also some decisions that we've made in the 2000s. Most notably, that has to do with the Stacey plan. We as a state enacted a portion of a grand tax plan by eliminating the sales tax on necessities, which makes it slightly more progressive, in 2002. But in 2007 and 2008, when it was time to implement the higher income taxes that were going to make up for those revenues, the state was flush with income from Hurricane Katrina. And so that portion of the plan was repealed. And so that means that today we have an even more regressive system that we need to have, and that we were meant to have if we had not repealed that portion of the Stacey plan. And I would say that it's something that is important to keep in mind going into session this year, because we're again in a situation of having temporary funds to help with another recovery effort, this time COVID-19, through the American Rescue Plan. But we mustn't let those dollars, which should be going to those who have been most harmed, to sidetrack us from tax structure reform that will advance equity in the state. The cumulative impact from centuries of decisions and recent decisions means that Louisiana has the 14th most unequal tax system in America. Next slide, please. So it's important to understand that in Louisiana, revenue neutral is not good enough. You're going to hear during the legislative session tax proposals that aim to be revenue neutral. You should always, I would recommend, look at tax proposals from a lens of racial equity. What does it do to right some of the wrongs and to adjust our structures so that they lean more toward equity instead of away? But you also need to keep in mind the amount of funding that we're not bringing in, partially through the Fed deduction, but where are our unfunded priorities in this state? We don't fund early care and education. We've made changes, but we don't fund it to the level that it is needed. We've made changes to other parts of our budget and our tax code that disproportionately hurt families of color. And one of those is within our TANF program. Louisiana has one of the most, least generous TANF to poverty ratios. For every 100 families in poverty who should be able to rely on a cash payment from the state to help boost them just a little bit toward sustainability, for every 100, only 4 are able to access a TANF payment through the state of Louisiana. We also have an EITC, an earned income tax credit, but it's one of the lowest in the nation at 3.5%. It's temporarily increased to 5%, but that is tied to the sales tax that will also, along with the EITC benefit, that bump will expire in 2025. And we don't have a state child tax credit, which could go a long way into helping solve for the fact that Louisiana has the second highest child poverty rate. Next slide, please. So what are the elements of tax reform that would help bend the arc of justice toward more equity in Louisiana? The National Academies of Science published a roadmap to reducing poverty and cutting it in half a couple of years ago. And they cited in this report that one of the most impactful policies is the child tax credit. Now, United Way and other folks on this call were tremendous partners in bringing the authors of that report to Louisiana, to New Orleans, to discuss what this could mean for our state. So we at Louisiana Budget Project recently proposed a plan that would cost $165 million and give families in the state $500 to $200 per child. Those in lowest income would get a higher benefit, and those with the youngest children would get a slightly higher benefit, up to $100,000 in household income. And we can make that investment this session and make a difference in a state with child poverty of 280,000 children living in poverty, 140,000 of which live in deep poverty at half of the poverty rate. So there are policies that we can put into place to correct injustices by putting in a child tax credit, by making permanent the increase in the earned income tax credit, by repealing the federal deductibility of income taxes in Louisiana, by proactively looking at the temporary sales tax expiration that is coming and getting ahead of it. We can also correct for some of the historical policies that Lamar talked about and that also show up in Charmaine's presentation about gender wealth disparities through policies like an inheritance tax, a millionaire's tax, and capital gains income. These, again, just help to level the playing field so that low-income families are not carrying a disproportionately high share of the tax burden in our state. Next slide, please. At Louisiana Budget Project, we know that it's important to have as much information at your fingertips when you're talking to your legislators. So we've created district fact sheets that have not only demographic information, but specific information about how the safety net is impacting the constituents in every legislative district in the state, House and Senate. You can go on our website and pull that when you're ready to sit down with one of your legislators and talk to them about your priorities and how to help our state be more equitable. We also have the Daily Dime. If anyone is not already a subscriber, that will keep you up to date on what's happening in the legislature, as well as policies that are happening on the national level that impact low and moderate income households here in our state. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this information.
Thank you, Stacy, and just a wealth of information, good historical perspective as well. Again, if you have questions or comments, please put it in the chat box. I don't see any, but I'm sure Charmaine, Lamar, Stacy are all waiting to answer your questions. And if you have a question for United Way as well. So we're going to move on to Alan Square for the Campaign for Equity New Orleans. And Alan, you have the shortest question, but a very hard question. Why should we care about the racial wealth gap?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Again, Alan Square, Campaign for Equitable New Orleans. We are really focused on making New Orleans the most equitable city in the world. And so what I'm about to present is a group of slides from a larger presentation around a study we conducted to try to understand when was the wealth gap created. And so I'll walk through that a bit and then try to end with why is it important that we fix it. But in this study, we look back at the history of New Orleans from the very beginning to when the city was settled all the way through to today. And what we found was this period, the most recent period post the civil rights era, is actually the most interesting when you study the wealth gap. And what I mean by that is you're now in a period where it's illegal to discriminate. And you'll see in this slide, or what we saw in all of our research, is that the gaps actually widened. So prior to the Civil Rights Act, it was legal to discriminate, but you could make an argument that Blacks and Hispanics were actually more well off when it was okay for racism to exist. And so in the slide that's presented in front of you on the left side is a comparison of white family wealth versus African Americans, and on the right is white family wealth versus Hispanics. And from the period of 1963 to 2013, you see amongst African Americans, the wealth gap grew by 7 times, and within Hispanic families, it grew by 6 times. And I'll go to the next slide now. And so when you look at unemployment rates, you see a similar widening of the gaps when you compare men versus women. And this data, the previous slide showed data nationally. This slide and the remaining slides will all be looking at New Orleans and the metro area. And so on the left side, you see employment rates for men, Black men being the black line, white men being the blue line, and you see the gap grew from 1980 to 2016 from 13% to 27%. And similarly with women, the gap didn't grow as much, but it did widen. Next slide, please. This slide is a little bit more complicated, and it does include the New Orleans MSA, which does include parts of Jefferson Parish and Metairie. But on the left axis is white percent of industry employment, And on the x-axis is all of the employment in the area, the industries in the area. The blue line shows the percent of white working age population. So the way you read this slide is, if the dot is above the blue line, means that white folk have a higher share of the employment in that industry. So if everything was fair, the dots will all be on the line, meaning that white folk would have their proportional share of the work, and Black folk and Hispanic folk and all other groups would have their proportionate shares. But as you can see, in almost all of these categories, white folk have a much higher share of the work. The only areas where they don't is in healthcare, where they have their proportionate share, transportation and warehousing, a proportionate share, arts and entertainment, and agriculture. The only areas where white folk have a lower proportionate share of employment is in accommodation and food, the hospitality industry. And we know in hospitality who's front of office and who's back of office. And then in administration and waste management. So picking up the trash. White folk have less of the jobs that pick up the trash. And I apologize, I use kind of very straight language when it comes to this, but this is a very straight topic that we should not be trying to sugarcoat. If you can go to the next slide, please. This slide is similar, but looking at average wages and along the x-axis is white workers' share of occupation and employment. The blue line, this time going vertical, shows the white percent of working age population again, but again, we just changed the orientation of the slide because it starts to show you this highly correlated fact is as the jobs increase in income, you see the higher population or a higher share of white workers in that field. So if in jobs less than 40,000, white workers have less proportionate share of the jobs, but anything over 40,000, it's a higher proportion of the jobs. So again, you could draw a line to show higher wage jobs, white folk have a higher share of those jobs. Next slide, please. This slide begins to compare by industry and average wage. Again, the blue dots are average white income in that industry. The black dots are non-white average income within that same industry. And then the red dots show where the wage difference between the non-white and the white folk are the same. And so again, you start to see the same pattern, right? When we're within an industry. So white folk already have a higher proportion of the jobs. But then even when I work in the same industry with you, you have a higher proportion of the income. And so the only places that Black folk are kind of, earning the same amount of funds within the same industry is legal, which is interesting, and in the sciences, which I haven't fully understood all of that and why that exists. But then, of course, in arts and entertainment. But consistently, even within the same industry, white workers are making a higher salary than Black workers. Next slide, please. And so the question that Mary posed is why is this important? And we at CNO try to say, okay, there's a moral imperative as to why the wealth gap needs to be eliminated. And if you don't believe it's moral and it's the right thing to do, it actually has an economic impact on our society and thus our utility and for all. And so this is a study or a comparison of several studies that shows what is the impact of closing the wealth gap on our GDP for this MSA. So gross domestic product. So on the very left, for our MSA, the annual gross GDP is about 78 billion. And so our partners at REI did a study and said, what if I just take the average worker of color and move their salary to the same as the average white worker? What's the impact on GDP? We see a 7% increase in GDP, 5.5 billion, not a trivial amount of money, And so when you think about the GDP, that the hypothesis that this country has always lived by is we are much better off if the GDP does better. And if you believe that, then it tells you that, hey, maybe we should be closing the wealth gap, right? And so the good folk at Policy Link actually went a step further. So in addition to controlling for the average salary, they said, what if we control now for the gaps in employment, higher incomes within city limits, adjustments for age, adjustments for income percentile, and then hours worked. And they said they would actually see a 24% increase in the GDP, about $18.5 billion. And then the folks from Kellogg, they conducted another study and said, yeah, all those things are good, but we're going to control for a few more things. What about productivity from educational gains? Because you've closed the wealth gap. What about consumer spending? What about tax revenues? What about savings on health expenditures, savings on criminal justice? Then you'll see a 25% increase in GDP. And so some folk might look at this data and say, hey, that's funny math, but this is the same type of math that we justify spending and giving tax credits to movies that come to town, to Super Bowl when we want the Super Bowl in town. This is the same type of secondary and tertiary impacts we justify to make those investments. And so we say at CNO, the investment in closing the wealth gap is more than reasonable, and it just makes economic sense, and we'll all feel the benefits of it. Mary, thank you so much. And I always like to be a part of this because I learned so much.
Well, thank you, Alan. And I always learn so much from you all. And I'm going to do another round with CNO. I'm an alum, but I got to go back, and because it's so much to learn around the racial wealth gap. And let me just say, if you've looked at our Alice report, it aligns so well with what Alan just talked about. If we can just do what's right and bring people to where they need to be, we can really have a huge impact on our GDP in Louisiana. So what we did do is give you a list of suggested readings for you to just look at and dig down into this data. We gave you a few books and also some articles, and then just digging in. If you have never heard of Prosperity Now, you need to look at their data. And then, of course, our own data center, we want you to just go and start reading about this, because we need to have informed citizens. As Charmaine always says, we have to be informed and to have the conversation. So I want to thank you. Next slide. I want to thank you for participating, and to our panelists, I want to thank you. Mary John, are there any questions in the chat that we need to address? I think we have a few minutes.
We do. We have one that says, what next? How do we change this for our community, state, and nation?
I think that is Michael answering. Did I hear Michael?
Sorry, Mary, I was on mute.
Okay.
So rephrase the question.
Mary, you want to rephrase the question?
The question was, great information, what next? How do we change this for our community, state, nation?
Well, yeah, I think you heard a lot of great information from our panelists to give us data to talk about, I think, from a policy standpoint. So I would suggest engaging with us in our journey around policy and all of our partners that work on this effort. I think beyond that, I think become educated, become informed, be a part of discussions and create these discussions within your circles and your networks.
If you want to make a profound impression, I would hope that you engage in the upcoming legislative session. We're going to change this through policy and advocacy. And I think you've heard from everybody that presented today, accurate, well-researched data. Inform yourself. And when you get the link to this, whoever your legislator is, you be sure to send it to them and let them know that you will be watching. And get on that website and track these bills. Your power is your voice. And those of us who care about this great state need to do our part in advocating for the change that we know can change the way we move that needle. And I think it's a moral imperative for all of us to take personal responsibility to be part of the change we want to see realized in this great state.
Okay, I
You
think
mind,
that's
Mary,
Alex.
yeah, you mind if I add to that? I mean, I think what's clear and what we've learned is that this has taken well over 300 years of intentionality to build this system. And it's going to take many, many years of intentionality to fix it. But recognizing the opportunities that we have in front of us are important too. It's a unique opportunity where you have folk who would not normally think about tax reform are thinking about it now because it's holding our state back. And so you have this now on the same side of folk people, those less needy. This is an opportunity to create big change and force it. But all of us within the realms that we work have to be proactive, be bold, be leaders, because this inequity exists in every system that we face.
And if I can add to that, I would say this session, we know that there are specific bills that are going to be introduced if they haven't already been pre-filed that you can speak to, point to contact your legislators, and consider also the role that your company or business can play and the influence that it can have in those halls as a voice for progressive change coming from more than just the folks on this webinar, but folks that that really have the ear of some of these legislators. Let them know that it's a priority. The child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, the Fed deduction, the sales tax, all of that is coming up, in addition to many of the bills that are mentioned in the chat: minimum wage, preemption, paid leave, equal pay. These are specific policies that are going to be on the docket this session starting Monday.
Hey, Mary, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think, I think everybody, I think kind of broadly the policy and advocacy work, especially given what's been mentioned around just this session and what's ahead of us. But I think it's imperative that we think about who's not in the room, who's not a part of these discussions, and begin to make those, begin to facilitate those discussions. A lot of us have gone through the Race and Equity Institute, so we've been grounded, we've learned, but we need more and more people to participate in those types of learning opportunities so we can gather critical mass to actually get the kind of changes that'll be not only enacted, but sustainable.
Thank you, Michael. Lamar, I want to give you an opportunity to have some closing.
Sure, I dropped a little statement in the question and answer chat a moment ago in terms of what next, what do we do from here? And I think, Mary, what you did at the end is one of the great next steps that we can all take, and it's to continue educating ourselves on the inequities that are out there and how they are formed, right? These things did not create themselves overnight. We have a tendency to imagine that folks who are in disadvantageous situations created that reality for themselves, and that people who are doing well all on their own are responsible for their own success, right? Not realizing who had help, who didn't have help, and how the various systems that we operate in create forces that make it very, very difficult for people to make different decisions that would improve their lives, right? And so educating yourself on that absolutely changes your mindset about the kind of activity that needs to happen to back ourselves out of the corner that we've put ourselves in, right? We need to be asking questions around how can it be? Why is Louisiana such a resource-rich state, yet one of the poorest in the nation? How can that be? Well, we can look to our history of policies, practices, and behaviors, some of which Stacy presented and others of us presented for answers as to how we got here, right? And what are the political arguments that are often used to shade these policies under certain philosophical ideas, but that we know will result in poor outcomes for people. These are the things that we can do next, right? And as Alan said, it's going to take action from people. It's going to take courage. It's going to take conversations and educating yourself to really move the needle in a different direction. But we can, because we all have the ability to vote for candidates and for policy and for opportunities that absolutely can move the needle in the right direction and actually fairly quickly if we adopt what we know needs to be done. Thank you for that opportunity, Mary.
Well, thank you, Lamar. Any last words from my panelists before we close out? No, well, we will be, and I saw in the chat, people ask if they're going to get the video or the slides. We will get those to you after. Everyone who is signed up will receive the recording and the slides. So don't worry about it. We're really happy that you want them because we want you to join us in this fight. Charmaine, the legislative session is starting. Stacy, I know you need champions, so be a champion. Follow us at UnitedWaySELA.org, the Louisiana Budget Project. Sign up and be part of the change, because I think if anything, if we coming out of COVID, we need to come out different. This is the once in a life chance in history to change history and to come out and do things and create the world we want to leave for our children and grandchildren. So thank you so much for joining us, and you all have a good day. And thank you, my panelists. I love you all.
You too, Mary.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Mary.